You know, I came here from Johnson Space Center in 1985, and what we did at Johnson was the Large Area Crop Inventory Experiment, where we managed to pull together a global set of Landsat data to see if we could tell the difference between wheat, corn, soybeans, and pasture, estimate the area, use a very crude regression model to get the yield, multiply the two to get crop production. So when I came here, the status of remote sensing was using photo interpreters to locate samples of corn, soybeans, wheat, and pasture by eyeballing Landsat images, then training those using maximum likelihood on every site, and then classifying the amount of wheat, corn, and soybeans, estimating the area, and so on. So it was very crude. We had no atmospheric correction algorithms that were really worth a flip. We had some, but they didn't do aerosols, for example, which is the big problem in translating signatures from one site to another. Calibration was iffy. And so all we really had was the capability to take what interpreters told us was there, train a maximum likelihood classifier, and estimate the area. So after Lacey, the Large Area Crop Inventory Experiment was over, I moved to Goddard, and I met this, I don't remember the first time I met Piers. He was just sort of getting here, and I was meeting people, but I remember the first time I had a meeting with him was in his office in Building 22, which used to house the Coke machine. So there's just room enough before they moved the Coke machine out to go in and get a Coke. And so there was Piers in there, had occupied it with a desk and a chair, and he had, if you wanted to meet with him, you had to close the door and open a folding chair and sit next to his in his office to have a chat. And so Piers started telling me about this wonderful project he'd been thinking about, headquarters had been thinking about, along with Bob Murphy. And hello.
Google takes over.
I don't have any email work. Yeah, Google takes over. And I didn't know dip about climate or weather or fluxes. I was a physicist, so I could understand the language, but I really didn't know anything about it. And so when we did Fife and Boreas, I sort of took the lead on the remote sensing part, and Piers took the lead on everything else, the logistics, monitor. I mean, he was a trained pilot. He knew how to organize all this stuff. I think his dad was kind of in the military historian, and Piers had gotten all the ideas about how to organize fuel campaigns. And so I was just sort of tagging along, trying to keep up and to do the best I could on remote sensing. So I want to talk a little bit about the progress we've made from these two field experiments, from the old days that I left at the Large Area Crop Inventory Experiment to where we are today. So the first publication announcing this was by Piers, myself, and others associated with it. And I'll just read this quickly. In the summer of 1983, a group of scientists working in the fields of meteorology, biology, remote sensing met to discuss methods for modeling and observing land surface interactions on regional and global scales. What did they conclude? First, that the existing climate models sucked. And secondly, the satellite remote sensing sucked. And so the aim of Fife was to improve both the models and the remote sensing. And the idea was to use a multi-scale experiment. This is the state of the technology, by the way. Remember, we had, when we carried to Fife, we carried Macintosh computers that had, I think, 28K of memory, and we had to shove them under the seat. They would just barely fit under the seat and haul them around. That was our technology. And of course, Piers was our main graphics technology at the time. He was pretty good with a pencil and paper. And so the idea was to go from the small scale, where we really understood something about the biophysics, and translate that up, as Piers says, to the satellite and regional scale to see if the relationships we understood at the leaf level could be used to translate our understanding of fluxes to the satellite level. And so this was basically the idea of upscaling and downscaling. We use the upscaling to translate our knowledge from the leaf level to the satellite level, and then we downscaled once we made maps and parameters and fluxes from satellites and aircraft. Then we translate that back down for validation. So here was the job that we were given as remote sensing people. So talking to Piers, he says, and others, this is what we need to know from remote sensing. First of all, we need to know the surface energy budget. We need to know what the net shortwave is. We need to know what the net long wave is. We need, therefore, to know a lot about the atmospheric aerosols and clouds, because after all, we're sitting above all of that, and the satellites, all we can measure at that level is radiance. Somehow we have to translate these into figures, into parameters. So we need to know, oh, by the way, water vapor, temperature profiles, and we'd also like to know cover type. We'd also like to know the light use efficiency, and the emissivity of the cover type, and then we'd like to translate that all into a net wave, a net radiation budget at the surface. No problem. Surface heat and mass budgets. We need to know basically the latent heat, the sensible heat, and the ground heat flux. So we'll know something about how that absorbed surface energy I just talked about gets dissipated in these various forms. And so we need to know the fraction of photosynthetically active radiation. We need to know the cover type. Is it a C3, a C4? We need to know the leaf area index. And that will then all be fed into a model to get us latent heat. If we know the canopy temperature, air temperature, roughness, length, we can say something about the sensible heat, the convective heat. And if we knew something about the ground snow cover, soil moisture index, and state, we could say a little bit about the ground heat flux, although it wasn't really a big player in the overall budget. And finally, we'd like to do carbon. This was later in Boreas, as Piers just said. So we need to know the net exchange of carbon. So the net exchange of carbon from vegetation is through photosynthesis, photosynthetic uptake of the carbon, and then respiration loss from the soils and the wood. So we need to know both of those. That means we need to know the biomass, the cover type, the temperature to get autotrophic respiration. We need to know the Li, FR, cover type, soil moisture, temperature to get the gross primary production. And then it'd be nice if we had soil moisture, soil temperature, snow cover to get heterotrophic respiration. Easy, right? Nothing to it. Just start with those remote sensing methods we had developed for crops, and it would translate immediately. Well, that did not happen. It was not the case. And oh, by the way, we needed to know something. It would be nice if we knew something about the light use efficiency, because the gross primary production, the uptake of carbon, is a function of the downwelling photosynthetically active radiation and the fraction that's absorbed. But also, not all of those photons are converted to carbon. So we need to know what fraction of the photons absorbed are converted to carbon, and that's the light use efficiency. The number of moles of carbon per mole of photons. And also, we need to know evapotranspiration. How much water is being taken back to the atmosphere? As Piers said, the old corrugated felt model was not a very good model for estimating. It tended to way overestimate the amount of precipitation. And we found that out from the models, the ECMWF models, the Aero 40 models, or the ECMWF models. We found that very quickly because we used their forecast for emissions planning and operations planning. And we found two problems. First of all, it always overpredicted precipitation. So we were always kind of calling off aircraft because you don't want to launch a bunch of aircraft, spend the money, gas, and time, and then not be able to take data. And in the winter, it tended to underestimate the temperature. It would always say it was colder than it actually turned out to be. And so you really couldn't operate in the dead of winter with the wind chills what they would be. So, so the idea, so one of the things that Boreas did, by the way, was allowed us to recognize those problems because we were in the field, and it allowed Piers and Fred and others to try to diagnose the problem along with Alan Betts to try to figure out how to fix the models. So we get at transpiration by taking the vapor pressure difference and the saturated vapor pressure difference. You have to involve this term, which is the stomatal conductance. G sub A is the aerodynamic conductance. The stomatal conductance is the one that regulates the transpiration of water through the leaf. And in order to get the transpiration water, we could use the Ball-Berry-Colatz relationship, which is basically a linear relationship relating the stomatal conductance to the gross primary production times the ratio of the humidity to the carbon dioxide concentration. So if we could get at GPP, then we could get simultaneously at the transpiration because water and carbon are coupled. So this was the scenario that Piers laid out in more detail. This is the kind of golden day we would have on several occasions in Fife, where we were underflying the satellites with a number of aircraft all the way down to the surface with the helicopter, and even we had in Fife the Aero Commander flying a gamma ray detector for soil moisture. So this was the data that we needed to test the scaling idea of going from the surface to the satellite and back down. So I want to just talk briefly now about some of the results that the staff, the Fife staff, produced during Fife. If you looked at Piers' teams in Fife, you'll notice there was no remote sensing team. There was a surface radiance and biology team, there was an integrative science team, but remote sensing is not one of the groups, although John Norman was making measurements at the leaf level and Blaine Blatt at the leaf level. We had aircraft remote sensing flying various scanners and so forth, but we didn't really have a remote sensing team. So what I'm going to talk about is the results that the Fife staff put together, largely. Fred Humrick is here, Scott Getz is here, you've heard from Piers, Jamie is sitting right up here front. So this was the group, this is some of our results. So we looked at how NDVI, first of all, how does NDVI, the normalized difference vegetation index, which was a well-known index, been used a lot by Jim Tucker, we really didn't know what exactly it was measuring. So Ghassem Aswar went out into the field managing his team there at Fife. They clipped a bunch of vegetation over meter-sized plots, went back to the lab, they separated the green leaves from the dead leaves, and what we found is that the relationship between NDVI and FPAR is terrible if you only consider the total FPAR by green and dead leaves, but it becomes really good if you only consider the green FPAR, that is the fraction of the total biomass to the green biomass. It relates very well. Well, this is exactly what we need to get at photosynthesis because the green FPAR is the only thing that matters in terms of the photosynthetic rate. We also looked at the scaling questions. If you take NDVI and you calculate it at 30 meters and you average it up to 1 kilometer, do you get the same thing as just a NDVI pixel at 1 kilometer? And the answer is for NDVI, almost. There's a little bit of bias. You do get some scaling bias in there. It's underestimating at low NDVI and overestimating at high. For some reason I don't show that here, but if you use the simple ratio, the scaling is it's a kind of evenly biased low. But it's very good. It's very close to the, so scaling up from 30 meters to 1 kilometer is okay. And if you put that all into SIB, which you show on the right side, if you take SIB and you initialize it for the latent heat flux at 1 kilometer versus initializing it at 30 meters and scaling up, you get a very good relationship, a very good agreement between operating at 1 kilometer and operating at 30 meters. So then we compared satellites. How well does spot NDVI compare to TM NDVI? Well, that's a very good comparison. So we could combine both spot and TM across the whole season. Here you see the NDVI versus the day of the year for 1987. And you can see how, you know, the green up in the beginning. Then you can see that during August there was a drought. You can see the drop off in the NDVI. On the bottom is the soil moisture. You can see how the soil moisture plummeted here. That was mostly Steve Unger fighting chiggers on his hands and knees to get soil moisture. And then you can see a nice rain on about day 213 or so. The NDVI recovers. And so we had basically a very nice way to combine spot and NDVI to track the seasonal variation across the year. You notice here this big green patch in August. It turns out that this was a private rancher who did things his own way. He planted a different kind of grass, I guess for his cattle. Piers visited this guy several times and tried to talk him into letting us onto his farm to his ranch to do some measurements, but I think he struck out on that. Didn't work. Okay, so sensible heat didn't work out quite so well, at least in the work we did. When you try to compare, the sensible heat release is basically a function of the canopy temperature minus the aerodynamic temperature. The aerodynamic temperature, the air temperature and the canopy temperature. We tried to measure the canopy temperature using thermal the thermal channel and converting that, knowing the emissivity of vegetation is near 1 to a temperature. And when we compared the radiometric temperature to the aerodynamic temperature, we didn't see a very good relationship, primarily because, and when you try to use that to compare sensible heat to the measured sensible heat from the towers, the measurable sensible heat from the aircraft, you got even a poorer relationship, primarily because the radiometric temperature depended upon the angle you looked at the canopy. It depended upon the wind speeds and so forth. So we were never able in '05 to get this work out. But well, when it got published, it caused a great stir and consternation among the aerodynamic, among the sensible heat community. And John Norman, I guess, and others organized a conference over in Europe to solve this problem. And hopefully John will, maybe he won't talk about this, I don't know, but we'll see. Supposedly he's got that problem all solved. We just didn't know what we're doing. So, okay, here's the simple ratio, the test of scale invariance. Simple ratio at 30 meters averaged up, NDVI 30 meters averaged up, and then I've already shown these results. If you put it all into SIB, calculate flux at 30 meters, and then calculate it at 1 kilometer. Works out to be pretty good. So we developed remote sensing algorithms to produce seasonal, annual, decadal maps of vegetation type, biophysical properties, both at regional and global scales. We developed a quantitative methodology for using vegetation indices to monitor surface energy, water, and carbon exchange. And I think we developed a much better physical understanding of what vegetation indices were measuring and how they depended, importantly, on view angle effects and atmospheric effects. So we went into Boreas with quite an advanced capability over the capability we had when I arrived from the Johnson Space Center. So I want to talk about this paper that John Gammon and all these authors wrote, kind of summarizing what we learned in Boreas. Let me just say that at the very top, I think, and this has already been said by peers, Boreas and 5 made a major contribution to our 21st century decadal survey recommended missions. A lot of what we learned went directly into white papers, and both from the radar, the passive microwave, the LIDAR, and the optical. And what we showed in Boreas, I think you could develop a multi-platform, multi-altitude capability. And we demonstrated the scalability to space for these key vegetation, soil, and climate measurement algorithms. I think without knowing that, it would have been very difficult to go forward developing the many algorithms that were developed for EOS and the platform. We learned a lot about radar freeze-thaw. I remember Kyle McDonald came up to me at one of the Boreas meetings. He said, guess what? We have this amazing ability to see the surface thaw out with C-band, I believe it was. And I remember talking to Alan Betts about this, and he was really excited because he knew what it implied for the beginning and start of the energy exchange at the beginning of the growing season. So you can see that this very clear signature between backscatter and when the soil begins to thaw out, you see a very clear change in the backscatter, and this turned out to be very key for initiating the start of the carbon models, and learned a lot about the transport of water from the surface, water vapor from the surface. We also looked in Boreas, we advanced a little bit further into the carbon-water coupling, as Piers said. I've already talked about this, but the idea is that you could get, if you know something about GPP, you can also get at the latent heat exchange, because if you know the GPP, you can use the Ball-Berry-Collatz relationships to get at the conductance, and you can get at the GPP if you know PAR, FPAR, and the light use efficiency. There are two ways. Of course, Piers has already talked about how the SIB and other surface atmosphere transfer models were able to model GPP. One of the things that we focused on, in addition, in Boreas and after, is to try to get an actual remote sensing measure of light use efficiency. If we had that measure of light use efficiency, that could be a very important additional constraint on models such as SIB. So some of the work was using high spectral resolution data, many bands to do maximum likelihood classification again, to separate the landscape up into its various species types, and then try to relate the light use efficiency as measured from this photochemical reflectance index, to calculate the light use efficiency. These are some results that were developed from I think this was the Cassie, no, this was from Avarice imagery. So if there are two bands that define the photochemical reflectance index, it's the difference between the 532 nanometer band minus the 570 nanometer band divided by the two. Turns out that that index is very sensitive to downregulation of photosynthesis. And so this is some work done by Faiz Rahman showing that you could use Avarice to get a reasonable relationship. Although if you look, the relationship differs quite a bit. And so it was difficult to translate this over a space and time. One of the reasons is this movie running up here? There we go. One of the reasons is that the shadow fraction varies tremendously with illumination angle and view angle. So when you're using a satellite sensor, you're looking at a particular view angle, you're looking at a different amount of shadow each time. Well, the light use efficiency depends critically upon whether the leaf is illuminated or not. So a lot of the scatter we were seeing was from the fact that we were looking at canopies at different sun elevation angles and different view angles. But what we learned, this is Thomas now, Thomas Hilker and I. Thomas developed this Gazach called AmSpec, which could track the canopy 24/7 and view the angle, view the canopy under different conditions, view the photochemical reflectance index under different conditions. By the way, it's a sad story about Thomas. I don't know if all of you have heard, but he recently passed away at age 40 from a heart attack. So it's a very tragic departure of Thomas from among us. And so I just recently traveled to his memorial service in Corvallis from his colleagues there, which he was the last place, and so we had a pretty nice memorial service. We're also writing a memorial for Thomas, which will appear in Remote Sensing of Environment. But at any rate, Thomas, we were able to show that the variation in photochemical reflectance index with shadow fraction decreased if the canopy was very happy, very unstressed. That's the very top line. If the canopy is very unstressed, it turns out that the sunlit part of the canopy is not much more downregulated than the shady part of the canopy, and when it gets very stressed, it's very much more depressed in the sunlit portion. So by calculating the derivative of the photochemical reflectance index with shadow fraction, we developed some theoretical models to model that. This is the derivative of PRI with respect to shadow fraction versus the measured light use efficiency from towers at several different kinds of canopies. The DF49 was Andy Black's Doug fir canopy. So we had several different canopy types here. And the blue line here is the theoretical line. These measurements cluster very nice around the theoretical line. And so this algorithm, which is represented by this theoretical line, seems to be very independent of time of the day, types of canopies, and so forth. This is from Chris Proba, a satellite that was flown by the Europeans. It also is capable of looking at multiple angles. So this is the actual tower data. This is the satellite data. And you see how the data from Chris Proba fits both the theory as well as the tower data. And these were the types of satellite. This is the type of the range of different kinds of vegetation that we were seeing. And so this work was all done, of course, initiated during Boreas, stimulated by Boreas. Caroline Nicole came here from John Grace's lab and really got a lot of this research started. Caroline Nicole couldn't make it today because of other responsibilities, but she sends her best to us. Then we also, Thomas and I developed a data assimilation scheme to take the measurements of the light use efficiency and then use that to update a model such as SIB to constrain it using spectral measurements. And basically we demonstrated that and showed that that works very well, modeling how the light use efficiency depends upon vapor pressure deficit and temperature. We can then interpolate the light use efficiency we get during the satellite overpass to any time between the two overpasses using measured meteorological measured values for light use for vapor pressure deficit and temperature. We were able to demonstrate with in Boreas, we could use polarimetric radar data from AirSAR to estimate the biomass of the southern study area. And we also used SLICER, this brand new canopy scanning LiDAR flown on aircraft to demonstrate the potential for LiDAR estimates of biomass density. We did a lot of land cover work. Part of my group, we're trying to get away from the maximum likelihood approach and go to physically based classification. We had, by this time, very much improved atmospheric corrections and calibrations, so we could begin to think about actually trying to model the signatures of various land cover types, use a table lookup scheme to classify these various land cover types, And we were able to do this and also retrieve biomass from Landsat data over the southern study area to about an accuracy of about 4 kilograms per meter squared, which isn't too bad. We had many different people doing land cover maps. So if you want a good land cover map, you just about have your choice in the Boreas study area. There's still people using those, I see, in various publications. Jing Chen and crowd used a pretty clever scheme. I won't talk too much about it, but it's basically using historical data and climate data to estimate the carbon uptake across the Boreas region, and they found that Boreas was a source of carbon during the 1990s because of the increase in fire disturbance. But overall, they act as a small sink in the same period. So Piers has already shown this. The number of publications coming out of Fife and Boreas leveled off about 15 years or so after the start of the experiment, but there are still, I know, these a lot of this data ended up being with me as the first author, so I get a pretty good idea on LinkedIn or the other websites as to what kinds of data downloads we have. So I think we provided a foundation for the EOS data product algorithms, the decadal survey missions, using the helicopter spectrometer and scatterometer, the C-130 LiDAR, MODIS simulation experiments, the multi-frequency radar, AVERIS, and the Chieftain. We showed that you could infer 3D vegetation properties from multi-angle passive data. JEDI is now about to, in 2020 or so, fly on the space station, a LiDAR to measure 3D vegetation. By the way, this is a story in itself. Ralph's in the back of the room. Ralph has been the most persistent PI in the world. He went VCL, he went Destiny, and he went to another JEDI proposal, and now the fourth time is a charm. So looks like now we have LiDAR that's going to fly on the space station and get biomass, the great missing parameter. I think we demonstrated that soil moisture freeze-thaw could be mapped remotely. A lot of that is now being used in these kinds of studies of in above, looking at methane and carbon exchange. First demonstration that vegetation photosynthesis can be measured from remotely, and we could scale that to space. And I think we validated a lot of the energy, water, and carbon cycle models, such as SIB. And I think maybe Alan will talk about this later. Because we began to understand that the forecasts from the ECMWF are not very good in some instances, we were able to feed that back through Alan. They improved those forecast models. And not only did it improve the weather forecast where we were working, it improved the global forecast. So I think Fife and Boreas provided a solid foundation for the follow-on field experiments. BERMS, Canadian Carbon Program, LBA above. Hank Margolis is here today from headquarters, who led a lot of these follow-ons. Solid underpinnings for EOS, advanced our understanding of the roles vegetation played in carbon, water, and energy, and I think led to the possibility for many future remote sensing capabilities. So that's it. Thanks for your kind attention. And